So now I'd like to introduce our final speaker, Dr. Carmen Lawrence.
Thank you very much. I feel in the position here that I know less than probably everyone else in this room about the delivery of aid. I have always had a strong commitment, obviously, to human rights, but the connection between the two, which is partly what we're talking about tonight, is not an area of expertise. So you'll forgive me if I sound a little naive, but it's always helpful, I think, to approach areas of inquiry that are not your forte, because you discover things that I think are worth discovering. I want to talk first about something I do know a bit about, and that's the status of women around the globe. We've already heard from Julian that the Millennium Development Goals and other UN programs, for instance, and aid programs have been directed toward improving the status of women. One, because of the inherent justice of that cause, but two, because it has a big impact on bringing people in developing countries out of poverty. And I think it's timely to have a good hard look at the status of women in our globe. I'd have to say, when you have a close look, it's not a very pretty picture. Some women have fared very well over the last few decades, particularly in the developed world. There have been sustained campaigns to improve the status of women, and there have been expanded opportunities in some countries with the growing economic prosperity. But others, of course, as we're only too well aware, have fared less well, and a vast number of the world's women still live in poverty and are still treated as second-class citizens and worse. They lack resources and they lack power. And we have to, I think, confront the fairly unpleasant reality that globally the average condition of women remains not much changed, and in some cases indeed may have worsened since it became an issue of international concern. A fairly recent report by the World Bank indeed indicated that while extreme poverty has declined, the less than $1 a day category, progress has been very uneven. In fact, someone pointed out to me recently that while the percentage living on $1 a day has certainly reduced, the percentage living on less than $2 a day has actually increased. So they haven't moved very far. In sub-Saharan Africa too, the number of poor people has actually increased over the time that we've been looking at it, and GDP per capita has actually been falling. Women, of course, as we know, account for a growing proportion of those people who are income poor, and 2/3 of the people who can't read and write are women. They also make up the majority of the world's unemployed when you count paid work and underemployed, averaging 40% less pay. And yet their unpaid labour represents a staggering amount, some 16 trillion at the last estimate that I saw. Despite all of that, poverty still wears a female face. And it's not just, as I've indicated, about inadequate income, but also poor health and nutrition, sort of social circumstances that must underpin human rights, limited education, and lack of other elements of well-being, including the lack of power to influence economic and political decisions. Women in developing countries bear the brunt of the so-called capability-based poverty. And I'm sure you're all aware that Amartya Sen has pointed out, despite the biological advantage of survival that women are known to enjoy, there are approximately 100 million females missing on the globe, and he attributes this to female infanticide in small measure, but also to comprehensive neglect of female health and nutrition, especially during childhood. And we're all aware that pregnancy and childbirth can be life-threatening still in many parts of the developing world. 500,000 women, mainly from such countries, die every year from causes related to pregnancy, childbirth and abortion, and a further 18 million by estimates suffer disabling illnesses, many of them from sub-Saharan Africa. And a lot of these women still lack full reproductive freedom and sexual choice. They bear more children than they want. When you ask them, it's evident that something like 120 million women worldwide say they would want to avoid further pregnancies if they could, if they had effective contraceptive techniques, against the wishes very often of their governments and sometimes the religions of which they're part. And as we know, childbearing among adolescents is still far too common in these circumstances. We've also heard through the stories about trafficking that it's often women who suffer disproportionately from this sort of violence, but add to it some other pretty horrible experiences: rape, battery, incest, sexual abuse, honour killings, trafficking in women and girls, acid burning, dowry deaths. All these things are still appallingly commonplace in some parts of the world. And I was reminded a couple of years ago, while we were fretting about our inability to gain maternity leave here in Australia, at the same time, this was International Women's Day a couple of years ago, Iranian women were actually beaten for throwing off their veils. And about the same time, 25,000 South Asian women were actually the victims of burnings for not bringing in enough dowry. Women, of course, also continue to face violence outside the home in war and civil disturbances, and their fatality in war, along with children, has soared to nearly 80% by some estimates. And of course, armed conflict destroys societies, and women often bear the brunt of that destruction in the home, not necessarily in the war itself. Women and children are most likely to suffer when health services collapse and food is short. And of course, they're then subject to large-scale rape and sexual servitude. They're often the grim companions of armed conflict. Just have a look at what's been going on in Darfur, for instance. The noted US writer and feminist Robin Morgan once described women as society's canaries, living alerts to danger. And she's argued that a civilization can be gauged by the status of its female citizens. I have to say, if that's true, then our civilization is still in pretty serious trouble. And we can't continue to ignore the parlous state of so many women and children too around the world. Not to say I'm ignoring men, but this is an important issue for us to confront in the way we deliver aid and services. We have to confront the reality that today many women watch their babies die of preventable diseases, see their own lives cut short.